In 1779, in the heart of Rome, a controversial and unsettling medical trial took place that has since been shrouded in mystery and ethical debate. What makes this trial so chilling is not just the procedure itself, but the fact that it involved no living subjects. Instead, the test subjects were the deceased, bodies that were once filled with life, now cold and still, serving as the unwilling participants in an experiment that would push the boundaries of medical science and ethics. This trial, in many ways, marked a grotesque turning point in the history of medical experimentation. But it also raised questions that have never fully been answered. Imagine, if you will, a time when the lines between science and morality were not as sharply defined as they are today. The late 18th century was an age of radical ideas and immense change. The Age of Enlightenment had already begun its intellectual upheaval across Europe, challenging long-held traditions, especially in the realms of philosophy, politics, and science. The pursuit of knowledge had become a driving force, often at the cost of ethical considerations. It was a time when questions about the human body, disease, and anatomy were becoming increasingly critical to understanding the world. But in the shadows of this intellectual fervor, a darker side of medical exploration began to emerge, one where the thirst for knowledge sometimes outweighed basic human dignity. In this particular case, the trial in Rome was born out of an intense desire to push the limits of anatomical knowledge. Surgeons, doctors, and medical researchers were eager to better understand how the human body functioned, particularly in relation to surgical procedures that could improve the chances of survival during times of injury or illness. However, the question arose, how could doctors know more about the body without violating the ethics of living patients? How could they experiment without exposing their subjects to real, often life-threatening risks? The answer, it seemed, was in the bodies of the dead. There was, of course, a moral line that should have been drawn, one that many would argue should never have been crossed. The practice of using cadavers for study was not new in 1779. Throughout history, the study of human anatomy had been conducted on the bodies of the deceased. But this was different. This was a calculated, highly organized, and systematic medical trial that treated the dead not as objects of study in the traditional sense, but as experimental subjects in a scientific endeavor. The bodies were used to test surgical techniques, to explore the mechanics of human organs, and to simulate the effects of disease and injury, all without any consent from those whose bodies had been used. As we begin to piece together the story, we must ask ourselves, what kind of ethical climate allowed this to happen? What drove those who participated in this trial to use the dead in such a way, knowing that their actions could be seen as a desecration of life itself? What was the justification behind such an experiment, and how was it received by those who discovered it, or who even suspected that something was amiss? These questions are not easily answered, and the answers that do exist only complicate our understanding of medical history and the price we've paid for scientific progress. At the time, medical science was still in its infancy in many ways. The understanding of disease and the human body was rudimentary by modern standards, and medical practices were often inconsistent and crude. In such an environment, anything that promised a step forward, no matter how morally dubious, could be seen as a potential breakthrough. For many in the medical community, the opportunity to advance surgery and anatomy was worth the moral ambiguity. The idea of using the dead as a tool for medical discovery was not necessarily seen as taboo, but rather as a necessary evil to achieve greater understanding. The bodies of the deceased had become disposable, a means to an end. After all, they were no longer living. Why not take advantage of this? In many ways, this experiment epitomized the darker side of the medical field during this period. While the Enlightenment ideals were certainly spreading across Europe, advocating for the rights of the individual and the dignity of the human person, those same ideals were often ignored when it came to the body, particularly when it was no longer living. The boundaries of human decency were stretched, and sometimes outright broken, in the pursuit of scientific discovery. This was a time when the human body, both living and dead, was often treated as a mere vessel for experimentation. The chilling part of this experiment is that it wasn't just about conducting a one-off study. This was a sustained, ongoing trial. Bodies were routinely brought in, prepared, and used for specific tests and experiments. Some of these were simple dissections, but others were far more invasive. Surgeons and doctors used the bodies to simulate surgeries, even cutting open organs and manipulating them to understand how disease and injury might affect the body. For many, the bodies became nothing more than tools in a larger, more abstract experiment to uncover the unknown. As you reflect on this moment in history, you have to ask yourself, How did these doctors, these researchers, reconcile their actions with their own sense of morality? It's easy to look back from a modern perspective and criticize, but we must remember that the medical ethics of the time were still in their formative stages. The laws that govern medical practice today, which require the consent of the patient, the protection of their rights, and an understanding of bodily autonomy, were not yet in place. The idea that a living person should have control over what happens to their body, even after death, was a concept that had not fully taken hold in the public consciousness. However, it wasn't just the doctors involved in the trial who would have been complicit in this grisly experiment. The medical community as a whole was often willing to turn a blind eye to such unethical practices. While the general public might have been horrified by the idea of using the dead for medical experimentation, the professionals in the field seemed to justify it as a necessary part of the scientific process. This was a time when the line between life and death was often blurred in the name of progress. It was an era where bodies were seen not as human beings, but as instruments to be used and discarded. In Rome, as the trial unfolded, the medical community watched from the sidelines, either complicit or indifferent. The bodies that were used in the experiment were often those of the poor or the nameless, individuals who had no say in what happened to their remains. It's important to consider the social hierarchies at play here. The rich could afford a proper burial, while the poor had little to no control over their posthumous fate. In many ways, this trial reflected the power dynamics of the time, where the most vulnerable were subjected to experimentation without their consent, their bodies no longer their own. As we examine this event, we must also consider the role of secrecy in the trial. Did the doctors involved know that what they were doing was unethical? Did they justify their actions as necessary for the advancement of medical science, or did they simply not care about the moral implications? In a way, this secrecy only deepened the mystery surrounding the trial. Much of what we know about it has been pieced together from fragmented historical records and accounts from those who may have been involved, or who later spoke out about it. The question that remains is whether this trial was an isolated incident or a symptom of a larger issue within the medical field at the time. The lines between science and morality were never as clear-cut as we would like to believe, and this case serves as a stark reminder of the price that was sometimes paid for knowledge. The trial in Rome was not just a medical experiment. It was a moral dilemma that questioned the very essence of human dignity and autonomy. It forced society to confront the boundaries of what was acceptable in the name of progress, and it set the stage for future ethical debates in a medical field that continue to this day. The late 18th century was a time of intellectual revolution, marked by the rise of the Enlightenment and the birth of modern science. It was an era when thinkers across Europe began to challenge centuries-old traditions, seeking to reshape not only the way people thought about the world but also the way they understood themselves. This age of reason was characterized by a deep curiosity about the natural world, a desire to free human thought from superstition and religious dogma, and a relentless pursuit of knowledge. However, as this intellectual movement grew, it created a paradox, a tension between progress and ethics that would profoundly shape the future of medicine. The Enlightenment thinkers, while championing reason and scientific inquiry, often overlooked the darker implications of their pursuits. The Age of Enlightenment, spanning roughly from the late 17th to the early 19th century, was rooted in the belief that knowledge and reason could bring about progress and improve human society. It was a time when the great minds of Europe, philosophers like Immanuel Kant, John Locke, and Voltaire, along with scientists like Isaac Newton and Carl Linnaeus, were reshaping the way people understood the world. Their ideas encouraged rational thought, scientific experimentation, and the development of new systems of government and morality. At its core, the Enlightenment heralded a vision of a better world, one built on reason, humanism, and empirical observation. But this ideal was complicated by the rise of experimental science, which, at times, pushed the boundaries of ethics in the pursuit of knowledge. In the realm of medicine, this clash between progress and morality was particularly pronounced. For centuries, medical practices had been dominated by traditional beliefs and superstitions, with little real understanding of the human body and disease. Physicians relied on a mixture of ancient wisdom and rudimentary treatments, and the notion of experimental science in medicine was still in its infancy. However, as the Enlightenment took hold, so too did a new wave of scientific inquiry into the human body. Surgeons and physicians, inspired by the intellectual currents of the time, began to experiment in ways that had never been attempted before, often without fully considering the ethical implications of their actions. One of the most significant changes during this period was the increasing importance of anatomy and dissection in medical education. Understanding the human body became a central focus of medical study, as physicians and surgeons sought to unlock its secrets in order to improve their practice. For centuries, dissection had been a taboo subject, largely restricted to the realm of the few and the privileged. However, with the rise of anatomical studies, dissection became a necessary tool for advancing knowledge. The human body, once considered sacred and untouchable, was now seen as a scientific puzzle to be solved. This shift laid the groundwork for the troubling medical practices that would emerge in the years to come. By the time of the 1779 Roman medical trial, the growing demand for cadavers had led to a dark and grisly side of medical experimentation. Corpses, once viewed with reverence, were now being used as tools for scientific exploration. The desire to understand human anatomy and improve surgical techniques was undeniably important, but in the pursuit of progress, many doctors and researchers began to ignore the ethical boundaries that once governed the treatment of the dead. In a sense, the Enlightenment had created a new framework for scientific inquiry, one that prioritized knowledge above all else, even if that meant sacrificing respect for the dead. The trial that took place in Rome in 1779 was not an isolated event but part of a broader trend in which physicians and surgeons, particularly in Europe, began to experiment more boldly and frequently with the bodies of the deceased. The study of human anatomy had always been a controversial topic, but in the wake of the Enlightenment, the growing demand for anatomical knowledge led to a disturbing shift. The moral dilemmas surrounding the use of the dead in medical experimentation were not fully understood at the time, and many in the medical community saw these practices as a necessary evil to advance the field. The question of whether it was ethical to use human remains for medical purposes was overshadowed by the belief that the end justified the means, that the pursuit of scientific progress was more important than the rights of the dead. As the 18th century unfolded, the field of surgery was rapidly advancing, but it was still fraught with uncertainty and danger. Surgeons were desperate to improve their skills, especially in performing life-saving surgeries, but the lack of proper anatomical knowledge made these procedures perilous. Surgeons often relied on crude methods, and the human body remained a mystery to many. The dissection of cadavers provided a way to learn about the body's internal structures and functions, but it also posed a significant challenge. How could researchers be sure that what they learned from a dead body would apply to the living? After all, the body after death was not the same as the body in life. This is where the trial in Rome becomes so unsettling. It was an attempt to bridge this gap between the dead and the living, using the corpses of the deceased to simulate surgeries and explore the effects of various medical interventions. This shift in medical practices was not universally accepted, and resistance to the idea of using cadavers for experimentation existed even during the Enlightenment. Religious and cultural views about death were deeply ingrained in society, and the treatment of the dead was often seen as a sacred act. In many parts of Europe, the Church held significant sway over social and cultural practices, and religious doctrines shaped the way people viewed the body and its treatment after death. The belief that the body was sacred and should be treated with reverence made the growing use of cadavers in medical experiments highly controversial. Many believed that such actions were a violation of the body's sanctity, and that medical practitioners who engaged in these practices were committing a moral and spiritual offense. In Italy, and particularly in Rome, the role of the Catholic Church was pivotal. The Church had long held a monopoly on education, and its teachings often influenced not only religious matters but also cultural and scientific ones. The Church's stance on the treatment of the dead was clear. Respect for the body was paramount, and any desecration was an affront to God. However, by the late 18th century, the Enlightenment had begun to challenge the Church's authority, particularly in intellectual circles. While the Church maintained its influence over the general public, the growing scientific community in cities like Rome began to push the boundaries of accepted medical practices. In this context, the trial of 1779 can be seen as a reflection of the growing tension between traditional religious beliefs and the rising influence of scientific inquiry. As more and more physicians and surgeons sought to advance their understanding of the human body, they began to treat it as an object to be studied, dissected, and experimented upon. The sanctity of the body was increasingly seen as secondary to the pursuit of knowledge. In many ways, this period marked the dawn of a new era in medical history, one in which the line between the living and the dead, between ethics and progress, became increasingly blurred. By the time the trial in Rome took place, it was clear that the Enlightenment had set the stage for a dramatic shift in medical practices. The idea that scientific inquiry should be free of moral constraints had begun to take hold. Doctors and surgeons began to prioritize their search for knowledge over the traditional concerns about the sanctity of the body. The dead were no longer seen as sacred, but as raw material to be used in the name of progress. This shift in thinking would pave the way for many more controversial medical practices in the years to come, as the line between ethical behavior and scientific advancement continued to grow increasingly hazy. The question that remained, of course, was whether these advancements were worth the moral costs. Was it acceptable to use the bodies of the dead in this way, particularly if it meant furthering medical knowledge and potentially saving lives in the future? Or were these actions a violation of basic human dignity, one that would haunt future generations? These questions, though raised during the Enlightenment, remain as relevant today as they were in 1779, as we continue to grapple with the ethics of medical research, experimentation, and the treatment of the dead. In the late 18th century, Rome was a city that stood at the crossroads of tradition and progress, a city where the echoes of antiquity mingled with the ambitions of an emerging scientific world. While it had long been the center of Catholicism, the heart of the Enlightenment era was slowly creeping into its intellectual and medical circles. The medical community in Rome, like elsewhere in Europe, was on the brink of transformation. Advances in the understanding of anatomy, disease, and surgery were opening new avenues for discovery, but these breakthroughs were often complicated by the ethical boundaries that still held sway over many minds. This was a time when physicians and surgeons, inspired by the intellectual revolution sweeping across Europe, found themselves torn between the desire to push medical science forward and the deep-rooted traditions that cautioned them against crossing certain lines that, at times, seemed too easily erased in the pursuit of knowledge. One of the most striking aspects of medical life in Rome during this period was the city's peculiar position as both a center of tradition and an incubator for revolutionary scientific thought. On the one hand, the Church had long held sway over the city, setting social and moral standards, including those concerning death and the human body. Catholic doctrine held that the body should be treated with utmost respect, as it was the vessel of the soul and the creation of God. The Church's teachings reinforced the sanctity of the human form, prohibiting its desecration, especially after death. Bodies were to be laid to rest with dignity, ensuring a peaceful transition into the afterlife. This reverence for the body was rooted in religious beliefs that had governed Western thought for centuries. On the other hand, the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment were beginning to take hold in Italy, albeit more slowly than in other parts of Europe. Thinkers and doctors, inspired by the works of Descartes, Newton, and others, began to challenge long-standing ideas about the human body, disease, and the boundaries of medical practice. The Church's influence was still powerful, but the rise of secular intellectual movements questioned many of the traditions it had protected, particularly in matters related to human anatomy. The shift was gradual but undeniable. As the Enlightenment took hold, it brought with it a new spirit of scientific curiosity, one that sought to understand the inner workings of the human body in a way that had never been attempted before. In the heart of Rome, the intellectual and medical circles began to gravitate toward these new ideas. But this tension between scientific progress and religious orthodoxy wasn't just a philosophical debate, it was reflected in real, tangible practices. Surgeons and physicians began to focus increasingly on anatomy, trying to understand the structure of the human body so that they could perform better surgeries and develop treatments for the myriad diseases and injuries that ravaged the population. However, this understanding of anatomy could not be achieved without direct study. Dissection became a critical part of medical education, but it was also a practice fraught with moral and logistical challenges. In 1779, the medical landscape in Rome was shaped by the advances made in dissection and surgical experimentation. The demand for cadavers to study the human body was growing, but so was the difficulty in obtaining them. The use of human remains for medical purposes had been taboo for centuries, particularly in Catholic regions like Rome. For many years, the bodies of the poor, criminals, and the nameless had been used for scientific study, but their use was heavily regulated. Yet, as the thirst for anatomical knowledge deepened, the need for more bodies that had not been donated voluntarily, became more urgent. This is where the practice of using the deceased in medical trials began to blur the lines between ethical boundaries and scientific necessity. In Rome, as in other parts of Europe, the bodies used for dissection were often those of the poor, or those who had been condemned to death. These bodies, once discarded or deemed worthless, were now valuable to the medical community as they could provide invaluable insights into human anatomy and pathology. However, the question of consent was never fully addressed. The idea of consent, particularly when it came to the bodies of the dead, was a concept that had not fully taken hold in the public consciousness. The moral implications of using the deceased in this way were rarely discussed in the medical community. At the time, medical education and experimentation were still relatively primitive compared to modern standards, and the line between scientific inquiry and moral corruption was often difficult to see. Surgeons and doctors of the period were driven by a desire to improve their understanding of the human body, to reduce the number of patients who died under their care. But in their relentless pursuit of knowledge, many ignored the ethical implications of using the dead as mere tools for research. For some, the idea that a dead body was no longer a person, but simply a vessel for study, made it easier to justify such practices. After all, if the person was dead, what harm could be done? Yet, while some doctors and researchers were driven by a genuine desire to improve the lives of the living, there were others whose ambitions were more self-serving. The pursuit of fame, recognition, and advancement in the medical community often overshadowed the need for moral reflection. Rome, as the seat of Catholicism and a city steeped in religious tradition, was not exempt from this moral ambiguity. In fact, the very religious significance of the city seemed to heighten the paradox. Here, in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican, some of the most groundbreaking medical practices were being carried out, yet these practices were inherently at odds with the city's religious values. The trial of 1779 was the culmination of this tension. It was an experiment that, on the surface, promised to advance medical knowledge in ways that could save lives, yet it did so at an ethical cost that few in the medical community fully recognized at the time. What made this particular trial so disturbing was not just the use of cadavers in medical experiments, but the deliberate and systematic way in which the bodies were used to simulate surgeries and test new medical techniques. These were not casual dissections or isolated studies. This was an organized and planned series of medical interventions carried out on the dead to see how they would react under specific conditions. The bodies were subjected to invasive surgical procedures, including the cutting and manipulation of organs, to simulate the effects of injuries and diseases. Surgeons were hoping to understand how the human body responded to trauma, disease, and medical treatments. The idea was that by studying the dead, they could find ways to save the living. This was an era where surgery was still in its infancy, where infections could kill a patient just as easily as the injury or illness that led them to the operating table. Surgeons were desperate for new techniques, new ways to ensure survival, and the bodies of the dead seemed like the perfect subjects for experimentation. Yet, even as this experimentation was taking place, there was a growing awareness that what was being done was wrong, morally, spiritually, and perhaps even scientifically. The use of cadavers in this way, while accepted by some in the medical field, was deeply controversial. The idea that the dead could be treated as mere objects for dissection and experimentation was, to many, an affront to the dignity of human life. There was also a profound irony in the fact that the very people who were trying to extend life through their medical experiments were, in essence, desecrating the dead in the process. In Rome, this tension between tradition and progress was particularly pronounced. The city was the center of Catholicism, and the Church had long held that the body should be respected in death as it was in life. Yet here, in the very heart of the Catholic world, a medical experiment was taking place that completely disregarded this sacred view of the human form. The moral ramifications of this experiment went beyond the medical community. They touched on deeply held religious beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the sanctity of the human body. In this sense, the trial of 1779 represented a critical moment of collision between the old world of religious tradition and the new world of scientific inquiry. Despite the moral quandaries, the results of the trial were seen by some as groundbreaking. The knowledge gained from these experiments contributed to the development of more advanced surgical techniques and a deeper understanding of human anatomy. In a time when medical treatments were often crude and ineffective, this kind of experimentation held the promise of progress that, in theory, could lead to better care for the living. But that promise came at a heavy price, one that the medical community at the time seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to fully acknowledge. The unsettling reality of the 1779 medical trial in Rome is not just the fact that the dead were used as experimental subjects, but that these actions, carried out in the name of scientific progress, raise profound ethical questions that are still relevant today. It is a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, while noble in many respects, can sometimes come at the expense of humanity's most basic values. In Rome, this trial was a moment in time when the boundaries of medical ethics were stretched beyond recognition, with consequences that would echo throughout history. In 1779, the practice of medical experimentation took a chilling turn with the use of deceased bodies in a trial that would not only push the boundaries of medical knowledge but would also challenge the very ethical foundations of the era. What makes this trial so unsettling is not simply the fact that it involved the use of corpses, but the way in which those bodies were treated. These were not just bodies used for rudimentary dissection or anatomical study. They were the subjects of a systematic and calculated medical experiment designed to test the limits of surgical and medical practices. The experimenters, armed with the conviction that their work would lead to scientific breakthroughs, did not hesitate to violate the sacredness of the body, using the dead as mere tools in their search for knowledge. At the heart of this disturbing experiment was the use of deceased bodies for testing new surgical techniques and medical theories. In many ways, this trial was an expression of the growing desire among physicians and surgeons to improve their understanding of human anatomy, surgery, and disease. But while this hunger for knowledge was undoubtedly driven by a genuine desire to improve medical practices, it was also marred by the disregard for basic human dignity. The bodies used in the experiment were often those of the poor, the nameless, or the unclaimed, the most vulnerable members of society, who had no voice or control over what happened to them after death. To many, this was a profound violation of the sanctity of the human body, a disregard for the very essence of what it meant to be human. The bodies were obtained through various means, some of which were morally questionable. In many cases, they came from the city's hospitals, where the unclaimed dead were stored. Others were taken from the morgue or from those who had died in prison. These were not bodies donated for the purpose of medical study, but rather the remains of individuals who had either no family to claim them or had been discarded by society. The lack of consent for their use in medical experimentation adds a layer of ethical violation that makes this trial particularly troubling. Once the bodies were obtained, they were meticulously prepared for the procedures. Surgeons and physicians who participated in the trial viewed the corpses as raw material, as vessels that could be dissected and manipulated to simulate the conditions and effects of real-life medical scenarios. The purpose of the trial was not just to study the anatomy of the body, but to experiment with surgical techniques, to understand how different procedures would affect the human form and how disease and injury could alter the body's functions. The medical community of the time was in desperate need of advances in surgery. Many surgeries, particularly those dealing with wounds or internal injuries, were performed without any real understanding of how the body would respond. Without modern antiseptics or anesthesia, these procedures were often brutal and ineffective. The trial, therefore, was viewed by some as a necessary step toward improving these practices. The idea was that by understanding how the body responded to certain surgical interventions, physicians could develop more effective and less traumatic procedures. However, the methods used were far from humane. The corpses were cut open, their organs exposed and manipulated, and their tissues subjected to the same types of surgical procedures that would later be performed on the living. The bodies were used in a series of experiments designed to test the effects of various medical conditions, injuries, and diseases. Surgeons would simulate injuries, apply various treatments, and observe how the body reacted, often in gruesome detail. The purpose was to simulate the real-world effects of trauma and to study how the body healed or failed to heal. This approach, while revolutionary in its ambition, was deeply troubling in its execution. The dead, who had once been human beings with their own identities, families, and stories, were reduced to mere objects for scientific study. Their bodies were no longer seen as sacred, as the vessels of their souls, but as tools for progress. The idea that the end justified the means became a driving force behind the experiment. The doctors involved in the trial justified their actions by arguing that the knowledge gained from these experiments would eventually lead to improved medical treatments, saving countless lives in the future. But this justification was rooted in the belief that the pursuit of knowledge and progress was more important than the rights of the dead, or the ethical responsibility of the living to treat the deceased with respect. The question that arises here is whether the use of the dead in this manner was truly necessary for medical advancement, or whether it was simply a case of scientific ambition unchecked by moral consideration. Some might argue that the knowledge gained from such experiments did indeed contribute to the development of better surgical techniques and a deeper understanding of human anatomy. After all, it was during this period that many of the foundational principles of modern surgery were established. Yet, even if the ultimate goal was noble, the means by which that goal was pursued were deeply unsettling. The bodies, once full of life, were now treated as objects, their dignity stripped away in the name of science. The lack of consent from the deceased or their families further compounded the moral dilemma. These were not people who had willingly donated their bodies to science. They were individuals whose remains were used without their knowledge or approval. In addition to the ethical violations inherent in using the dead for such experiments, the trial also highlighted the broader moral conflict between science and humanity that was emerging during the Enlightenment period. On the one hand, the Enlightenment championed the pursuit of knowledge, the use of reason, and the improvement of human life through scientific progress. On the other hand, it was also a period of great moral questioning, as new discoveries about the world and the human condition began to raise uncomfortable ethical questions. The use of human remains in medical experimentation was a reflection of this tension, a reminder that the quest for knowledge could sometimes come at a great moral cost. The trial also raises questions about the value of human life and the ways in which society treats those who are marginalized or forgotten. In this case, the bodies used for experimentation were often those of the poor, the anonymous, and the powerless, individuals who had no say in how their remains were used. Their lack of agency and voice in this process is a stark reminder of the social hierarchies of the time. The rich and powerful had the means to ensure that their bodies would be treated with respect after death, but for the poor, their fate was often determined by the needs and desires of those in power. The use of their bodies for medical experimentation was, in many ways, a reflection of the broader inequalities of the time, where the most vulnerable were often treated as expendable in the name of progress. In retrospect, the trial of 1779 can be seen as a turning point in the history of medical ethics. While it undoubtedly contributed to the development of medical knowledge, it also highlighted the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. The experimenters, driven by their desire to advance medical science, failed to consider the ethical implications of their actions. The use of the dead as experimental subjects was, in many ways, a precursor to the darker chapters in the history of medical experimentation, experiments that would later take place in the 19th and 20th centuries, where human beings would be subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment in the name of science. The question that remains, however, is whether the knowledge gained from this trial was worth the moral cost. Was the use of the dead justified by the medical advancements it led to, or did it represent a fundamental violation of human dignity? The trial of 1779, though long forgotten by many, serves as a stark reminder of the ethical dilemmas that continue to plague the medical profession to this day. While the pursuit of knowledge is undoubtedly important, it must never come at the expense of the dignity and humanity of those who are studied. In the case of this trial, the dead were used not only as subjects of medical research, but also as symbols of the moral compromises that were made in the name of progress. The bodies were no longer human. They had become mere vessels for the advancement of science, their once sacred form reduced to the raw material of medical experimentation. The ethics surrounding the use of the deceased in medical experimentation are profoundly complex, and the trial in Rome in 1779 brings to light one of the darkest and most ethically contentious chapters in the history of medical science. This trial not only exemplifies the tension between the pursuit of knowledge and respect for human dignity, but also reflects the broader societal attitudes towards death, class, and morality during this period. The experiment, driven by the ambition of surgeons and physicians to improve medical practices, raised fundamental questions about the rights of the dead, the role of consent in scientific experimentation, and the moral cost of medical progress. The decision to use the bodies of the deceased for such experiments was rooted in the scientific ambitions of the time. Surgeons and doctors of the 18th century were struggling with the limitations of their knowledge. Surgery, though vital for treating a range of conditions, was still an imprecise and often dangerous practice. Many medical procedures, particularly those dealing with internal injuries, diseases, or trauma, were carried out with little understanding of how the human body functioned under these conditions. Surgeons had no reliable way to predict how different medical interventions would affect a living body, and their methods were often crude and ineffective. The idea of using cadavers to test new techniques seemed like an inevitable step forward. However, the lack of any moral framework to guide such experimentation left room for exploitation, especially when it came to bodies that were unclaimed or belonged to society's most vulnerable members. While medical science had made enormous strides during the Enlightenment, there remained a deeply ingrained tension between the scientific imperative to advance knowledge and the ethical considerations that guided other aspects of human society. At the time, the use of cadavers for medical purposes was not universally condemned. Dissection and the study of human anatomy had long been a part of medical education, and the need for more bodies to advance surgical techniques was widely recognized. However, the nature of the 1779 trial in Rome went beyond the usual practices of anatomical study. It was not just a matter of learning about the body structure, it was a calculated effort to push the boundaries of medical experimentation, using the dead not as passive subjects of study but as active participants in surgical trials. One of the central issues with the experiment was the fact that the bodies used had no voice in the matter. They had not given their consent to be used for these procedures, and in many cases, neither had their families. This absence of consent reflects the broader ethical dilemma that emerged in the wake of such experiments. How far could medical science go in its pursuit of knowledge without violating the basic rights and dignity of individuals, even those who had passed away? In a time when the concept of bodily autonomy was still in its infancy, this was a question that had no easy answer. The right of the living to control what happens to their bodies was not a widely accepted notion, and the dead, in many respects, had no agency at all. This left the door open for the exploitation of bodies, especially those of the poor, the forgotten, and the marginalized. The bodies used in the trial were largely those of individuals who had no means to protect themselves in life, let alone in death. Most of them were unclaimed bodies from hospitals, prisons, or the streets, those who had died without family or identity. The stark reality of this is that these were individuals who had already been stripped of their dignity in life, and their death did not offer them the protection and respect that one might expect for a human being. This reflects the social inequalities of the time, where the poor, the criminalized, and the unnamed were treated as disposable. The bodies of these individuals, in the eyes of the medical establishment, were seen as expendable resources, their worth only recognized in terms of the knowledge they could provide. What made this experiment particularly unsettling was the way in which the bodies were used. They were not simply dissected for the purpose of understanding anatomy. They were subjected to invasive, painful procedures designed to simulate real-life medical interventions. Surgeons would conduct experimental surgeries on the bodies, cutting open organs, manipulating tissues, and subjecting them to conditions that could replicate the effects of injury or disease. This was not a passive study of the body's form, but a deliberate and calculated attempt to understand how it responded to trauma and medical treatment. The body was no longer viewed as a vessel of the individual who had once lived in it. It was an object to be manipulated in the name of progress. This depersonalization of the body, the stripping away of its inherent human value, marked the dark turning point of the trial. Even more troubling was the fact that these procedures were carried out without any significant oversight or regulation. At the time, the field of medical ethics was not yet fully developed, and there were few laws or guidelines governing how bodies could be used in scientific experiments. The physicians involved in this trial, motivated by a desire to advance their field, had little concern for the ethical implications of their actions. Their focus was on the medical breakthroughs they hoped to achieve, and the bodies were viewed as tools for that goal. In many ways, this trial epitomizes the unchecked ambition of the medical community during a time when the desire for knowledge outweighed the moral consideration of the methods used to obtain that knowledge. This lack of ethical concern was compounded by the fact that the bodies used were often those of individuals who had been marginalized by society. The poor, the homeless, and the criminalized were often the ones whose bodies were used for dissection and experimentation. These individuals, already disenfranchised in life, had no means to protect their dignity after death. Their use in medical experiments was part of a larger societal tendency to dehumanize the most vulnerable. The ethical breach here is not just the use of the dead for medical experimentation. It is the way in which these individuals, who had already been marginalized and silenced in life, were completely excluded from the conversation about their own dignity and rights in death. They were, in essence, erased from history, their bodies exploited in the name of science. There is a deeply unsettling irony in the fact that this trial took place in Rome, the heart of Catholicism, a city where the sanctity of life and the body was enshrined in religious doctrine. The Church had long taught that the body was sacred, that it was a temple of the soul, and that respect for the body after death was a moral imperative. Yet, in the very city where these teachings were most strongly upheld, a group of medical professionals ignored these values in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. This underscores the paradox of the time. While the Enlightenment was pushing science and reason to the forefront, it was also challenging traditional religious values. In this case, the triumph of scientific curiosity came at the expense of religious and moral principles that had long governed how the body should be treated, especially in death. The medical community's attitude toward the body in 1779 was emblematic of the larger tensions between science and morality. The desire for knowledge was so strong that it often overshadowed the moral considerations that, in hindsight, seem essential. The experimenters justified their actions by emphasizing the potential benefits for society, arguing that the knowledge gained could lead to better surgical practices and, ultimately, save lives. The end, in their view, justified the means. But this line of thinking is fraught with danger. History has shown that such justifications can be used to excuse a wide range of unethical practices in the name of progress. The very concept of scientific advancement is often manipulated to justify actions that are morally indefensible. The trial in Rome, then, serves as a chilling reminder of the complexities of medical ethics. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the cost of scientific discovery and the boundaries of ethical behavior. It is easy to look back from a modern perspective and criticize the actions of those involved, but the truth is that at the time, the line between what was considered acceptable and what was not as clearly defined as it is today. The ethics of medical research, particularly concerning human subjects, have evolved over the centuries, but the moral dilemmas faced by physicians in the past continue to inform the debates we have today about consent, autonomy, and the treatment of the dead. This story is not just about a dark chapter in medical history. It is a story about the ever-present tension between the quest for knowledge and the respect for human dignity. The trial of 1779, while contributing to the advancement of medical science, also served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the pursuit of progress must always be tempered by an unwavering commitment to ethics and human rights. It compels us to consider the value of human life, the dignity of the individual, and the lengths to which we are willing to go in the name of scientific discovery. And it forces us to ask the difficult question, at what cost does knowledge come? As the 18th century drew to a close, the world was on the cusp of monumental shifts in both intellectual thought and scientific exploration. In Rome, as elsewhere across Europe, the Enlightenment was beginning to bear its most profound fruits. Knowledge was expanding at an unprecedented rate, and the desire to understand the human body was driving an era of experimentation that would change the course of medical history. Yet, amidst this intellectual awakening, there lingered a stark reality. The medical breakthroughs that were so desperately sought after often came at a grim price. This price was paid not by those in the halls of academia or the operating theatres, but by the very people who had no voice in the matter, the deceased whose bodies were used in brutal experiments for the advancement of medicine. The story of the 1779 Roman medical trial is in many ways a testament to this harsh truth, that the path to progress can sometimes be steeped in ethical violations, and that the human cost of knowledge is not always fully understood in the pursuit of scientific discovery. The trial, itself, was not simply an isolated event, but part of a broader cultural shift in the medical world. In an age where anatomical knowledge was becoming the foundation for surgical progress, the dissection of human bodies was increasingly seen as a necessary evil. Surgeons and physicians were desperately trying to overcome the limitations of their craft. Many of the medical practices of the time were primitive by modern standards. Diseases, injuries, and surgeries were often treated with crude, ineffective methods. The lack of proper understanding of human anatomy and the body's response to injury left physicians grasping at straws. Yet, with every new dissection, every new experiment, new insights were gained. It seemed as though every answer revealed new questions, leading to a relentless pursuit of deeper understanding. The underlying belief was that in order to make progress, to reduce suffering and save lives, new knowledge had to be gleaned, and sometimes, that knowledge could only be found through invasive, untested methods. This is the context in which the 1779 trial took place. Surgeons and physicians, armed with the power of reason and backed by Enlightenment ideals, believed they were justified in using cadavers to simulate surgeries and to test the limits of medical procedures. The trial was designed not simply to learn about human anatomy, but to subject the body to specific conditions that mimic the effects of injury, disease, and surgery. In this quest for knowledge, the boundaries of morality were stretched thin. The disturbing aspect of this trial was that it was not simply a matter of understanding the human body. It was about pushing the boundaries of what was possible in medical practice. Surgeons were not merely performing dissections but were actively manipulating the bodies of the deceased to simulate surgical procedures that had never been tested before. For example, new methods of treating internal injuries or performing amputations were tried on the bodies to see how the human body might respond. The idea was that by observing how a body healed, or failed to heal, under these conditions, surgeons could develop more effective techniques for treating the living. But what is often lost in this calculus of progress is the fundamental question of whether these methods were ethical, whether the dead could truly be used as instruments for such experimentation. In this particular instance, the bodies used were largely those of the marginalized. Many came from hospitals or prisons, where the deceased had no family to claim them, no voice to protect their dignity. They were the forgotten of society, those who had been disregarded in life, and whose remains were now seen as expendable. The absence of consent here is a critical factor in understanding the ethical shortcomings of the trial. In a society that did not yet fully recognize the importance of bodily autonomy or the rights of the deceased, the bodies used for these experiments were seen as objects to be used for the greater good of science. And yet, the question remains, Does the end justify the means when it comes at the expense of those who cannot defend themselves? The trial also sheds light on the relationship between science and ethics in the context of the Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was supposed to be a time of progress, an era when reason and intellectual inquiry would lead to a better understanding of the world and the human condition. But in this quest for knowledge, the very ideals of human dignity and respect were sometimes disregarded. The trial in Rome can be viewed as a manifestation of this contradiction. It was an attempt to reconcile the pursuit of scientific truth with the ethical considerations that had long been governed by religious and moral traditions. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and progress often clashed with older, deeply ingrained moral values, leading to a situation where the pursuit of knowledge could sometimes be justified even at the cost of ethical principles. This trial, in particular, highlights the dehumanization that occurred in the pursuit of progress. The very concept of progress in medicine was inextricably linked to a belief that the bodies of the dead could be used as tools for the living. But these bodies were not just the remains of individuals, they were symbols of the broader societal attitudes toward death and the marginalized. They were the bodies of those who had no power to consent, no voice to resist. In this sense, the trial can be seen as part of a larger pattern of exploitation that permeated both medical and social practices at the time. The dead were not treated with reverence. They were treated as raw material to be used in the quest for knowledge. In this light, the trial becomes a disturbing reflection of how those without power, whether in life or in death, could be discarded and used for the benefit of others. What makes this case even more unsettling is that it took place in Rome, a city at the very heart of Catholicism, a religion that taught that the body was sacred. The Catholic Church had long held that the body should be treated with respect, and that the act of dissection and desecration was a grave sin. The Church's teachings were clear: the body, even in death, was a vessel that should be treated with dignity. Yet, in the very shadow of the Vatican, medical practitioners engaged in an experiment that was, at its core, a violation of these sacred teachings. This paradox underscores the tension between religious values and the burgeoning field of science during the Enlightenment. As medical professionals pushed the boundaries of knowledge, they found themselves at odds with long-established moral and religious doctrines. The Enlightenment had brought with it the promise of progress, but this progress was not always ethical. The conflict between scientific progress and ethical consideration is one of the most troubling aspects of the 1779 trial. The knowledge gained from the experiment, knowledge about the body's response to surgery and injury, undoubtedly contributed to the advancement of medical science. But the cost of that knowledge was the violation of basic ethical principles. The very essence of the human being, their dignity, their autonomy, their rights, was disregarded in the pursuit of progress. The bodies used in the trial were not just instruments for experimentation. They were human beings who had once lived, loved, and had identities. In treating them as mere objects, the medical professionals involved in the trial betrayed the very humanity they sought to understand and improve. This event raises a fundamental question that has continued to resonate in the centuries since. How far should science go in its pursuit of knowledge? When is the search for understanding no longer justifiable, especially when it involves the exploitation of the vulnerable? The 1779 medical trial in Rome provides a stark and unsettling answer. At times, the thirst for knowledge can blind those involved to the ethical implications of their actions. The ends do not always justify the means, especially when those means involve the violation of human dignity. Moreover, this trial highlights the need for the development of medical ethics as a field in its own right. At the time of the experiment, there were few regulations or guidelines governing how human remains should be treated. The concept of informed consent was non-existent, and the idea that individuals could have control over what happened to their bodies after death was still a foreign concept. Today, these issues are central to the field of medical ethics. The 1779 trial in Rome serves as a reminder that the development of medical science must always be accompanied by a thoughtful consideration of ethical principles, particularly when it involves human subjects. In modern times, the lessons learned from such trials have shaped the way we approach medical experimentation and the treatment of the deceased. The rise of ethical guidelines such as the Declaration of Helsinki and the Nuremberg Code, developed in the aftermath of some of the darkest chapters in medical history, has set clear standards for the use of human subjects in medical research. The principles of informed consent, respect for autonomy, and the obligation to do no harm are now foundational in medical practice. However, the trial in Rome remains an important reminder of the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition and the ethical compromises that can arise when the pursuit of knowledge is not tempered by respect for human dignity. The 1779 trial, despite its contributions to the advancement of medical knowledge, represents a dark chapter in the history of science. It serves as a stark example of how the desire to understand the human body and improve medical practice can, at times, lead to the exploitation of those who are most vulnerable. The trial raises important questions that continue to challenge us today. How do we balance the quest for progress with respect for human dignity? What safeguards must be in place to ensure that medical experimentation is conducted ethically? And most importantly, how do we ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten as we continue to push the boundaries of science and medicine? The implications of the 1779 Roman medical trial extend far beyond the specifics of the procedures that were carried out. It offers a profound reflection on the nature of scientific progress, the limits of human dignity, and the moral and ethical considerations that continue to haunt medical practice today. The trial is an unsettling reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, while noble in many respects, can also lead to profound ethical lapses when guided solely by the promise of progress. This darker side of scientific inquiry raises questions about what we are willing to sacrifice in the name of discovery, and whether the potential benefits can ever justify the deep moral costs that are incurred. In considering the lasting impact of this event, it is important to recognize the social and cultural context in which it occurred. Rome, at the time, was the seat of Catholicism, a place where religious and moral values were deeply entrenched in both public and private life. The Catholic Church had long upheld the sanctity of the body as sacred, created by God and deserving of respect, both in life and in death. The Church's teachings on the body and the soul guided the beliefs and actions of millions, shaping not only spiritual life but also the everyday practices of citizens, including how they viewed the dead. Within this context, the use of human bodies in medical experimentation represented not only a violation of these deeply held beliefs, but also a contradiction of the very principles upon which the city of Rome was built. The idea that the human body could be treated as an object for dissection and experimentation ran counter to the Catholic understanding of death. The Catholic faith emphasized the importance of the soul's journey to the afterlife, and in this belief, the body was seen as more than just a vessel. It was an integral part of a person's identity. Even in death, the body was treated with a reverence that reflected the sacred nature of human existence. In the eyes of the Church, the body was meant to be treated with respect, laid to rest in a manner befitting its connection to the soul. Against this backdrop of religious reverence, the medical practices being carried out in 1779 took on an even more sinister tone. The act of using the dead for experimentation in Rome, particularly in such a calculated and invasive manner, created a striking dissonance between the values of science and the moral framework that had been in place for centuries. Surgeons and physicians, driven by their pursuit of medical knowledge, disregarded the deeply held cultural and religious beliefs surrounding death. While their intentions may have been to advance surgical techniques and improve medical care, the ethical breaches that occurred during this trial cannot be ignored. One of the central ethical issues in the trial was the absence of consent. The idea of consent, particularly in the case of the dead, was a concept that had not yet been fully explored or appreciated at the time. Today, we understand that informed consent is a cornerstone of medical ethics. It ensures that individuals have the right to understand what will be done to their bodies and to make a choice about whether to allow that action. But in 1779, the notion that a person's body should be respected after death, or that the deceased should have any say in how their body was used, was still a distant and largely unexamined idea. The bodies used in this trial were obtained without permission from the deceased or their families, many of whom had no means of knowing what had happened to their loved ones after death. In this sense, the trial exemplifies the disregard for human autonomy that was common during this period, a time when the rights of the deceased were largely overlooked, and bodies were seen as raw material for scientific progress. This disregard for consent is not only ethically troubling, but it also reveals a deep-seated assumption about the worth of the poor and marginalized. The bodies used in the trial were often those of the most vulnerable members of society, the poor, the unclaimed, and those who had died in prison. These individuals, who had no voice in life, were stripped of any agency in death. Their remains were used without any consideration of their identities, their personal histories, or the lives they had lived. They were reduced to nothing more than objects for dissection and experimentation. The notion that a person's life and death could be so easily ignored, particularly when it came to the most vulnerable, reflects the systemic inequalities that existed in society at the time. It also reflects a broader pattern of exploitation that existed throughout much of the history of medical science, where the poor and powerless were often seen as expendable. The trial also underscores the tension between scientific ambition and ethical responsibility. Surgeons and physicians involved in the trial believed they were contributing to a greater good, the advancement of medical knowledge. Their hope was that by testing new surgical procedures on the dead, they could improve the care provided to the living, particularly in the context of traumatic injuries and diseases. There was a genuine desire to reduce suffering and save lives, but this goal was pursued without sufficient consideration for the ethical boundaries that should have guided the use of human bodies. The trial represents a moment in history when the drive to push the limits of knowledge and practice led medical professionals to set aside moral and ethical concerns. The assumption was that the ends justified the means, that the potential benefits of advancing medical knowledge outweighed the harm caused by the exploitation of the dead. Yet, as history has shown us, the consequences of this ethical blindness are profound and far-reaching. The lack of oversight, regulation, and ethical reflection in the 1779 medical trial created a dangerous precedent for future medical practices. While the knowledge gained from the trial did contribute to the development of surgical techniques, it also set the stage for more extreme forms of medical experimentation, many of which involved living human beings. The line between scientific inquiry and human rights became increasingly blurred, and the potential for exploitation grew as the tools of medical science advanced. The history of medicine in the 19th and 20th centuries is filled with examples of unethical experimentation, from the Nazi medical experiments during World War II to the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States. These atrocities, while on a different scale, share the same roots in the disregard for human dignity and the failure to apply ethical principles to medical research.